Today's lesson 4 ends series 2 of During the Genesis Flood. We started off with compelling evidence for a global flood, then went to Genesis flood washing away millions of years, and then we started part 1 of addressing Noah's Ark questions. And then this week we'll do part 2 of addressing Noah's Ark questions, like how did Noah's family take care of all the animals and much more. And then the second half of this talk will be reviewing some of the global flood legends. And then next week, we start series 3 after the Genesis flood. And lesson 1 is one of my favorites because it's the Ice Age. Only the Bible explains it. And this is a National Weather Service employee came up with the only working Ice Age model. The only way it could work is with the aftermath of the Genesis flood, and we'll get into that in detail next week. Lesson 2, January 21st, we'll talk about the post-flood weather and climate, and you'll find interesting evidence like, did you know that the Sahara Desert used to be lush and green and there was all kinds of animals living there? And also, you'll find out that when the Ice Age came, it drove animals further south, and then it retreated, and we'll get into all those type of details. And lesson 3 is I think an excellent talk on Tower of Babel, origins of nations, where did all the people groups go, and also we'll talk about how did the animals from the ark, because remember we talked about kinds, there was only 2 dogs that needed to be on the ark and 2 cats. Out of those 2 dogs and 2 cats, all the different species we see today, and we'll get in a little bit of that as well. And then the final series 4 is creation versus evolution. Lesson 1, millions of years, where did the idea come from? Lesson 2, 8 men, the grand deception. And the next one is radioactive radiocarbon dating, turning this foe into friend. And then the last 2 lessons, evolutionary inaccuracies, and this will take us into March 3rd, dangers of evolution. Today's talk is lesson 4, answering Noah's Ark question, part 2, and global flood lessons. So I want to start it off with a video summarizing kind of what we've already discussed, really Noah's Ark and flood, and Ken Ham will give a video kind of summarizing where we've been so far. So I'll play this and it'll go a few minutes.
Was there really a Noah's Ark and flood?
In Genesis chapter 6 through 9 in the Bible, we read there about an account of a global flood in the time of Noah. That flood, according to the Bible, was sent by our Creator God because of the wickedness of man as a judgment because of their rebellion against their Creator. Now Noah was called by God to build a boat for he and his family and representatives of all the animal kinds, the land animal kinds, to survive this global flood. Was there really such a flood? Could Noah really build such an ark that would fit all the representatives of the land animal kinds on board the ark? Actually, if there really was a global flood that covered the highest hills under the whole of heaven, as the Bible describes, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And actually, what we find are billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. I'm talking about the fossil record. Most of the fossil record is actually the graveyard of the flood of Noah's day, not a result of millions of years of deposition, as the secularists tell us. There really was a global flood. The evidence is crying out at us from all over the earth. But could Noah actually build such a boat to take 2 of every kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing animal? Well, actually, yes. And in fact, most people don't realize he didn't need to take near as many animals on board the ark as we might think. For instance, today we have, when you look at dogs, dingoes, wolves, coyotes, jackal, bennet, foxes, and so it goes on, and our domestic dogs. Well, Noah didn't take all those on board the ark. Actually, he'd only need 2 dogs. When those dogs came off the ark after the flood, eventually different species formed. Dingoes, wolves, coyotes. That's not evolution, by the way. That's just dogs. That's just representing variation within the gene pool of the dog kind. When you actually work it out, Noah needed far fewer animals on board the ark than most people think. Actually, when you look at the size of the ark, as the dimensions are recorded in the Bible, you realize that Noah really built a boat bigger than what he really needed. Why would that be? Well, God is a gracious God. And you know, when the animals were on board the ark and Noah and his family are on board the ark, that ark then stood for 7 days before God shut the door. What was happening during those 7 days? Well, the Bible says that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. I believe he was calling the people of that time to come on board the ark and to come through the doorway to be saved. But they scoffed at God's word, and then God shut the door. Actually, Noah's ark is a picture of salvation. You see, there's a coming judgment by fire, not by water next time. And God's provided an ark of salvation for us, the Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus said, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he will be saved. Jesus is our ark of salvation. And just as surely as there was a flood, and we see the evidence all over the earth in the fossil record, just as surely there's going to be coming judgment by fire.
Okay, so hopefully that was encouraging, his summary. So let's start with point number 1. How did Noah's family take care of those, say, less than 7,000 animals? Now, I'm going to be referencing most of the information from this book entitled Inside Noah's Ark. It's written by Laura Welsh. And what it talks about is what was the water storage? How did Noah have enough water and food for the ark? We'll talk about the feeding and watering of the animals, waste water systems. How did they get rid of all the waste material from all the 7,000 animals? What was the light source in the ark? What about ventilation? How did they get ventilation in? Genesis 6:13 says, "And you shall take for yourself of all food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them." And here are some pictures from the ark encounter, kind of showing Noah's family and how they stored the food on the ark. And they used a significant amount of grains, seeds, dried fruit, and dried vegetables. Also, they loaded the ark with as much food as possible, allowing space for other necessities, like animal enclosures, working spaces, and living quarters. And I'll show you some examples of those. And like I mentioned, Noah and his family only had to feed less than 7,000 animals. We talked about that last time because it was the original kinds. Also, as we established in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 and 30, the animals were vegetarian. The thinking was they expected about 15,000 earthen vessels, each with a volume of, say, 1.75 cubic feet. And what I have here is a cutaway of an earthen vessel, and then on the bottom you can see where the grains would have been stored to get through the greater than 1 year flood. Others stored food on the ark. Noah and his family received most of their sustenance from the stored food, like grains, root, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and dried fruits. So they stored the food that was not perishable and could last for over a year. They did not have to rely on just the stored food on the ark. They also had a garden on the ark. And here's some pictures of what the garden might have looked like. And also in the Bible, it talked about a top with windows. So there's a large window on the third deck allowing the family to grow vegetables and herbs to supplement the food storage. And then what about the water storage? How did all the animals get enough water? Well, the ark served as a huge rainwater collection device where the ark housed cisterns large enough for a 6-month supply. And preventing overflow, a series of valves and spigots could have been used to shut off the flow of water from the ark's roof, because you had 40 days and 40 nights of continuous rain, so the rain would come in from the top. And they had bamboo piping within the ark structure to deliver the new water into these large cisterns for larger animals to drink. And here's a picture of it, where you have the water being stored up top and then going through the spigots and falling into the large cisterns. So the ark served as a huge rainwater collection device. The rain falling on the ark roof and deck and then channeled into these pipes. And the cisterns, where it is stored for 6 months and distributed as needed. and the watering vessels in the animal pens and cages. So the rain comes into these cisterns, and then the pipes feed these containers where it could fill up for about 6 months, and then they have the thinking was there's extra containers or they could deliver even more water when the floodwaters ended. So there are watering vessels in the animal pens and cages. And here's a picture from the Ark Encounter, and you can see this is a pretty large water vessel, which for the bigger animals, it just automatically feeds it like we have pets today. So for the larger animals, which were about 15% of the total animals on the Ark, the valves and spigots could be used to control water flow into the large clay vessels that I showed you near the animal enclosures. And then water tanks operate like modern water dispensers like we have for pets, or even we see it chickens too. And then you can see, so anytime the animal wants to take a drink, and then it'll take a while to empty this large container. Now, also large food feeders could hold several days' worth of pelletized food and dry vegetation. And this could be like one of Noah's sons opening up those big containers and then pouring it into the chute so the animal could eat for several days. That way they don't have to feed them all the time. Now, smaller animals, they figure about 85% of the animals were smaller than, say, a beagle dog. And for the smaller animals, they would have these smaller water and food containers, and they were numerous in efficiency, and they would have it horizontal and vertically stacked, and I'll show you why that's important. But each water feeder was designed as vacuum-fed vessel and reduces frequent filling of the containers. So here's each small animal cage had water and food, and they could drink water and eat for several days. We addressed the animals eating. Remember, we said dinosaurs were brought onto the Ark, and they tended to be a little bit bigger. But what did the dinosaurs eat? Institute of Creation Research, a short video, will talk about the latest science that they found.
Still, they had to eat. Wouldn't they attack other animals on the Ark?
When I was in graduate school, I was taught that dinosaurs and grasses were separated by millions of years. And now, within the past decade or so, it's been discovered that dinosaurs ate grass. And they showed in the fossilized, the coprolites, the dung of the dinosaur, 6 different species of grasses, including something as common as rice. And so all of a sudden now we find that the rice and the other species of grasses are brought together along with the dinosaurs, and there's no separation of the alleged millions of years.
Okay, so they're finding in the fossil record that the dung of the dinosaurs had grasses and rice and vegetation. So isn't that interesting? Kind of verifies what the Bible says, that animals tended to be vegetarian. So in the Ark Encounter, they try to depict the animal kinds, similar animals that may have been there during Noah's time. So you have cages for the antelope kind, the rhinoceros kind, the giraffe kind, and actually they believe that back in Noah's day, the giraffes did not necessarily have long necks yet. That came out later. The horse kind, the stegosaurus kind, hippopotamus kind. They even had the spinosaur kind, or baryonyx, tyrannosaurus kind, bear kind, deer kind, and pig kind, and the casiid kind. This is an extinct animal that we don't see today. As darkid kind, and sloth kind. So you get a sampling of what kind of animals and the size they were on the cages if you go to the Ark Encounter. There's a hole in the ship. What do I mean? There's a term called a moon pool, and the Ark Encounter designers placed 2 moon pools in the stern or the Ark's back end, straddling the keel. And these moon pools, and you can see here that are capped off with vertical shafts. So they're capped off with vertical shafts extending upward to the height of the Ark. These shafts are opened at the bottom, permitting a free flow within their interior. One moon pool is an integral part of the waste removal system on the ark. The other moon pool is used for ventilation, as the in and out mechanism or movement of the water acts like a massive bellows circulating air through the ark. So this is the waste moon pool here, and this would be the ventilation moon pool. So let's get into the wastewater systems. A simple but unpleasant fact of life is humans and animals produce liquid and solid waste that you would have to get out of the ark with almost 7,000 animals, right? An effective management system for removal of the waste from living areas was critical. Large number of animals with 8 people in a closed environment in the ark for, say, a year was a huge challenge and had to be addressed before the journey began. So a solution to this problem was needed. So the design of the ark was not meant for crew or animals walking about on the roof. The ark door was not designed to be opened up to throw waste material out the door. Remember, God shut it, and it was supposed to be sealed until they were free to go out. So they couldn't be throwing waste material through the roof or through the door. So opening at the top of the ark was not designed for waste products to be tossed out without landing on areas of the roof. Remember, we said that the water was collecting, so if you threw it out the roof, the waste material might mix in with the water, and that causes sanitation problems. So Noah's family collected rainwater, like I mentioned, from the top of the ark, and you wouldn't want to pollute the water with this sewage. But amount of labor to remove the waste would have been difficult but manageable. So a common collection point and labor-reducing method of removal from the ship was required. So the large animal waste removal, the Ark Encounter team designed this large animal exclosures with animal transfer system. So each large animal cage has 2 doors, and one door opens to the aisleway, and that's here at A. The second door opens into the cage from the side, isolating the animals in the aisleway, and that would allow C for one of Noah's sons or daughter-in-laws to come in and clean the pen. So waste is also collected in carts and taken to the stern. Small animal waste, the Ark Encounter design showed Noah's family used small carts and wagons to move the waste around. So simple cage designs become multifunctional when stacked so waste can fall from the cage. So they're vertically, so the waste would fall and then collect down here on section 3, and then one of Noah's sons or daughters-in-law could sweep it out and then put it into a wheelbarrow and take it away. So it was directed to an open center area, then a simple incline collection point, so it could be gathered and transported. So solid waste removal. The waste is dropped down a shaft into a central collection point. You can make that out, envision that as like Noah's son with a wheelbarrow dumping the waste down to the bottom where there's a central collection point here, number 2. And then the thinking was there was an animal-powered chain pump that carries the waste up to the top, and then the waste is released into this dispersal shaft here at number 5, and then drops into the moon pool. So here's the waste removal moon pool 6, and you can kind of see the chunks of waste. But what's beautiful is it's released into the floodwaters. So that opening, so all the waste material goes into the floodwaters and disperses into the ocean. What about the liquid waste removal? Thinking was that there were flat floors in the large animal cages that have lip around them, and a gutter runs along the intersection of a cage grouping. And the movement of the ship would separate the liquids from the solids. So the liquids drain from a gutter into a pipe extending the length of the ark and feeds into a liquid waste collection tank. And a chain pump inside the collection tank would lift the liquid waste to the top of the collection tank, then funnel down a chute into the waste moon pool. So you have one chain taking all the liquid waste, throwing it up and coming out into the moon pool, and another chain taking all the solid waste and coming into the moon pool. So then it gets flushed out into the ocean. What about the lights in the ark? Genesis 6:16 says, "You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above." So this plays a key role in the life of the ark. So it provides natural light as energy source for plants, and easier to complete chores across the entire ship. There were windows on the sides so they could open it up even when it was raining to allow light to come inside the ark, and you can see how the light would flood into it. Now, when the rain stopped, then they could open up the top and allow even more light to come in. But that's not the only light source that was available at that time. Also, they could use artificial lighting, which may have been used throughout the ark. And olive oil could have been used as a long-lasting fuel source for lamps lighting the dark interior. And when we were at the ark encounter, they actually showed how much light that those olive lamps could actually generate. There was a lot of light that could be created for Noah and his family. So the moon pool concept could circulate fresh air throughout the ark, and they would utilize the power of waves by removing the dangerous methane gas that would develop because of all the waste material inside the ark. But methane is half the density of air and could quickly escape through the small openings. So having this ventilation system, you could get the methane to get out quicker. Also, the wave-powered purifier. So falling waves in the moon pool pulls in fresh air. So the rising waves would push fresh air up through the shaft from the bottom of the ark. And then as the wave goes down, fresh air could be directed into the lower level, ultimately bringing fresh air into all other decks. So by just using the waves up and down, that could circulate air throughout the ark. So there's also, at the ark encounter, they have living quarters, and they show how Noah, his sons, and his sons' wives may have lived. They called Noah's wife Amzara, they used as a name. And then here's Shem's living quarters as well. And as the curtain rolls by, we see Ham and his wife. And interesting that they have different people groups as part of the family, where Ham's wife was a darker brown-skinned lady, and Japheth and his wife in their living quarters. So they showed that they were intelligent enough to have a decent living quarter. Woodworking and blacksmithing was around back then. If they needed to do some maintenance while they were in the ark, they had that capability to do woodworking and blacksmithing. They wanted to preserve knowledge. So Noah's library would have preserved vital information for the new world, and there could be notes on science, family records, and animals, which eventually got to Moses because he wrote about Genesis' story. A sample of Noah's language from the ark encounter, saying that he had a language. Of course, they only spoke one language back then, so they wanted to preserve the knowledge and science from his day to when they got off the ark. So that's kind of the end of Noah's family and how they took care of the animals in the ark. Is there any questions anyone has on that before we go into the legends? Any comments? Okay. So this is part 2, Global Flood Legends. And as I mentioned, I'm using the Flood of Noah book as reference for this. And where and how many flood legends are there? We'll address that. Review specific flood legends like the Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll also review the Wanambo legend, or the Australian Aborigine. Also the Akkadian tablet. And the fourth one is a Chinese flood legend. And we'll also address problems with these other flood legend arcs. Did they actually survive a worldwide flood with their design? Do these flood legends, what do they have in common? And you'll find that there's a lot of commonalities. So the global flood legends. This is a picture I took from the Ark Encounter, and they took a bunch of diagrams of all the major flood legends, and there's flood legends on every continent, from North America, South America, Asia, Europe, Africa, even in Australia, and we'll talk about that. But if you see these upside down triangles, those are other flood legends. There are so many flood legends across the world. How many are there? Well, there's over 200 legends of an ancient global flood discovered all around the world. These legends vary in their level of consistency with the biblical account, but they're widely distributed. Many tales include things like a favored family who built a large boat and brought some animals. Also, survivors of a worldwide catastrophe sent by an angry deity. There are other similarities with the global flood legends, like man transgression, destruction from a divine being, a favored family, a vessel or means of safety provided, destruction by water. Interesting, huh? And humanity saved and animals saved. The legends are similar in a universal or global destruction, also landing on a mountain and birds sent out afterwards. And then also similarities with survivors worshiping and divine favor placed on those saved. So what is the best exclamation for existence of over 200 global flood legends? Are they merely unrelated tales of local catastrophes endured by each of the culture's ancestors? Are they simply recountings of a myth spread in ancient history? But the best explanation fits the Bible perfectly. Because after the Tower of Babel, people groups were spread out because God changed their languages, and they passed on their knowledge of this biblical flood through word of mouth. And their stories became distorted during many centuries of retelling. And you retell stories, and each time it gets a little bit distorted from the next person retelling it. And I have a clip from the Answers in Genesis where they talk about hundreds of worldwide flood legends and summarizes some of the points that I just made.
Is the Bible the only source for the worldwide flood? I'm standing here in the Flood Legends exhibit at the Ark Encounter, an exhibit that tells us the answer to that question is absolutely not. There are hundreds of legends from around the globe about a worldwide flood. And it's interesting because they have many of the same details. They'll talk about how God or the gods were angry with humanity because of something that humanity was doing. And so the one god or many gods said they were going to destroy the earth, and they warned one family or one righteous person to build this vessel, and whether it's a raft or a canoe or the ark itself, like you read in the Bible. And then they're going to have all the animals that they have to bring on board, and then the flood comes, wipes out every single person on the earth, except for the people on board that vessel. And sometimes at the end of it, they even send animals off to determine how deep the water is, or they even have a sacrifice afterwards, or there's a rainbow mentioned at the end of it. And we have all of these similarities. And skeptics will look at that and say, well, that's just because the Bible copied from ancient flood myths, or it's because missionaries went to these different places. And while that idea could account for some of the similarities in the accounts, it could never explain all of the many differences in those accounts. For example, the ark itself. The Bible is the only one that gives us a vessel that has the proper dimensions to survive and keep its passengers safe. You might have heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's an enormous cube that's 7 levels deep, and the flood lasts for a total of 7 days. A worldwide flood in 7 days is implausible, and that vessel would rock so badly from side to side, the passengers would never live through it. The Bible is the only one that gives us the dimensions of a vessel that would survive and keep its passengers safe. And the notion that missionaries would have gone to these different places and spread all of these wrong ideas about the flood, all of those differences between the Bible and the other flood accounts, doesn't make any sense. Why would Noah's name in one culture be 6 to 8 syllables long rather than just Noah? The biblical account makes perfect sense of that. That is, that as people scattered from Babel, they took that history with them of the worldwide flood, and generation after generation, as they passed that down, it's kind of like the telephone game. These little differences creep in generation after generation. That's where you get those differences. While those many legends give us just pieces of the truth, God's word gives us the whole truth. And that is that man was exceedingly rebellious before the flood, and God determined to wipe them out with a worldwide flood. Yet he showed his grace and mercy to Noah and his family and representatives of each of the land animals on board the ark.
So let's get into some of these ark legends. We'll start with the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there's an actual tablet, or the legendary King of Uruk. In 1853, the archaeologist Austin Henry Layard and his team were excavating the palace library of the ancient Assyrian capital in Nineveh. And among their finds were a series of these 12 tablets of a great epic. The tablets dated about 650 BC, but the poem was much older. The hero Gilgamesh, according to the Sumerian king, was the king of the first dynasty of Uruk, who reigned for about 126 years. And in this epic, it says, on his journey in quest of immortality, Gilgamesh met Utnapishtim. When Gilgamesh asked him how we got eternal life, Utnapishtim told him about the flood. When Utnapishtim lived in Shuruppak, the great gods decided to send a flood on the earth to wipe out all humans. The god Aya secretly revealed the god's plan to Utnapishtim. According to Aya's commandment, he transformed his reed hut into a ship and made all of his kin and relatives, craftsmen, and animals embark on its escape from the flood. So the great rainstorm continued for 6 days. When the seventh day arrived, the storm and the flood subsided. All humans outside the ship were turned into clay by the flood, and the ship eventually landed on Mount Nasir. After 7 days, Utnapishtim sent out a dove to see if the water had receded, but it returned after finding no place to roost. Next, a swallow also returned. Finally, a raven did not return. So he released the animals and offered a sheep sacrifice to the gods. So after hearing that story, let's do a comparison of Genesis with the Gilgamesh account. In Genesis, the extent of the flood was global, so was Gilgamesh. The cause, both were either man's wickedness or man's sins. It was intended all mankind in Genesis, Gilgamesh, one city, and all mankind. The sender, Yahweh, an assembly of gods. The name of the hero, Noah and Utnapishtim. And then righteousness was the hero's character. Means of announcement, Genesis direct from God, Gilgamesh in a dream. Ordered to build a boat, both yes. Did the hero complain? Noah didn't, but Gilgamesh did. In the Gilgamesh story, I'm sorry. And then the height of the boat, 3 stories. The Gilgamesh story was 7-story cube. The compartments, many, and the doors, they both had 1. Windows, at least 1 in both. They both had coating of pitch. The shape of the boat was similar to one I have up here with the ark, but yet Gilgamesh was a cube. Human passengers, they were family members. Gilgamesh had family and a few others. Other passengers were all kinds of animals in both. And the means of the flood, underground water and heavy rain. But in Gilgamesh, just heavy rain. They didn't have the fountains of the deep breaking open like it does in the Bible. The duration of flood was different. In the Bible's 40 days and nights, and in Gilgamesh, only 6 days and nights. And the test to find land both release birds. The types of birds were a little different. First in the Bible, raven and then 3 doves. In Gilgamesh, a dove, swallow, and then a raven. And then the ark landing spot, Ararat for the Bible, Mount Nasir for Gilgamesh, and sacrifice after the flood, yes, and blessed after the flood, yes. So a lot of similarities, but some slight differences. Now, I did want to talk about that cube-shaped ark, which he talked about in the video. So the cube-shaped ark was about 200 feet by 200 feet, which is about 41,616 square feet. The problems with it is there's no lighting or ventilation for the lower decks. Any tilting or rocking in the waves could make the voyage virtually unbearable. And you saw that video where it's a cube in the ocean with 100-foot waves that would toss the people and the animals in and it would kill them. The next one, the second of the four that I wanted to cover today, is the Wanable legend, or the Australian Aborigines. And in the earliest time, children mistreated the winking owl, Dumby, and angered the supreme being. And Gaja told Gajara to build a double raft because he was going to drown everyone by sending rain and a sea flood. Gajara gathered food and brought his family and birds, and of course, since it's down under, a kangaroo on the raft during the flood. Gajara sent birds to fly dry land after the flood, and the kangaroo was used as a burnt offering to the god Nagajja. And Gajja put the rainbow in the sky to keep the rain clouds back. Interesting that they sacrificed a kangaroo to their god, and that's how their story was different. So that's the picture of their double raft ark, and it was actually pretty small. It was 40 feet by 20 feet, which was 800 feet squared. It was one of the smaller arks in all the different stories. Problems with it, of course, people, animals, and supplies would be washed overboard with any size of a wave, and the raft would break apart if it were large enough for people and animals and supplies. The third ark legend is the Akkadian tablet in the Semitic Babylonian, and what I wanted to show here is it's this circular ark. They did find an ark tablet dated 1900 BC, and this tablet, and there's a guy holding a picture of it, tells of a round ship built by Atrahasis with excellent buoyancy. He received specific instructions from the god Enki. The size is close to about an acre, with walls 20 feet tall, made of coiled rope and stiffened by wooden ribs. A deck and roof was included as well, and there were waterproofing of the interior and exterior. Another amazing discovery, it tells of how the Babylonian animals entered 2 by 2, and only wild animals were specified. So there's a picture of what it looked like. It was circular, but then you have this piece in the center. So this was a 220-foot diameter ark, and the volume would be 38,000 square feet. Problems with it, the sides are too short to prevent waves from washing over and sinking the boat. And the reeds and rope are not strong enough to support the massive structure and pressure from the waves. So if you have a circuit, it would float on low waves, but big waves, it would flip it all the way over. And the fourth legend is the Chinese flood legend. And this legend of Noah, his wife and sons, Lohan, Loshen, and Jahu. And here's how the story goes in the Chinese flood legend. So it poured 40 days in sheets and in torrents, then 55 days of misting and drizzle. The waters surmounted the mountains and ranges. The deluge ascended leapt valley and hollow, and earth with no earth upon which to take refuge. A world with no foothold where one might subsist. The people were baffled, impotent, and ruined, despairing, horror-stricken, diminished, and finished. But the patriarch Noah was righteous, the matriarch Gabolian upright, built a boat very wide, made a ship very vast. Their household entire got aboard and were floated. The family complete rode the deluge in safety. The animals with him were female and male. The birds went along and were mated in pairs. When the time was fulfilled, God commanded the waters. The day had arrived. The flood waters receded. Then Noah liberated a dove from their refuge, sent a bird to go forth and bring again tidings. The flood had gone down into a lake, into an ocean. The mud was confined to the pools and the hollows. There was land once again where a man might reside. There was a place in the earth now to rear habitations. Buffalo then were brought, an oblation to God. Fatter cattle became sacrificed to the mighty. The Divine One gave them his blessing. Their God then bestowed his good graces. So there's 4 type of legends that you hear, and what do most of them have in common? After completing a study of these 200 flood legends, a researcher, Zami Aswana, this is from an article in 2005, a comparison from secular historical records and a comparative study of flood accounts. And this is the quote that came out of it. 95% of these traditions have common elements with Genesis, and they say that the flood was global, consistent with the secular historical records and the existence of the flood traditions around the world. And then when you look at side by side with some of these flood legends, and then you compare the differences, we see most of them held to a destruction by water. All of these are checked, and only one, the Egyptian flood legend, had a partial representation of the destruction by water. And you can see here, universal destruction was common, except for one. Some other commonalities. Humans saved were in most of them. The ark provided were in most of them. And let's see, some of the smaller differences might have been divine favor, not a full representation. But anyway, so you get the gist of it. There's a lot of similarities in these flood legends. This is an article from, it's dated a little bit, 1937, The Testimony of the Tradition to the Flood, from Bible League Quarterly. If this awful tragedy ever happened, if the entire human race perished save one family, and perished by the hand of God in the punishment of sin, then that judgment must have cast long shadows. Through generation after generation, the story must have lived on. It must have been the most awful and solemn recollection of our race. Many things may have been forgotten, but that could not be forgotten. There must have been some awful disaster that left its impress upon the minds of men before they scattered abroad upon the earth, and the traditions would in that case be a testimony to man's unity as well as to the fact of the deluge. Here's another article by John Morris. Why does nearly every culture have a tradition of global flood? He states, anthropologists will tell you that a myth is often the faked memory of a real event. Details may have been added, lost, or obscured in the telling and retelling, but the kernel of truth remains. When 2 separate cultures have the same myth in their body of folklore, their ancestors must have either experienced the same event or they both descended from a common ancestral source which itself experienced the event. The only credible way to understand the widespread similar flood legends is to recognize that all people living today, even those separated geographically, linguistically, and culturally, have descended from the few real people who survived a real global flood on a real boat, which eventually landed on a real mountain. Their descendants now fill the globe, never to forget the real event. But of course, this is not the view of most modern scholars. They prefer to believe that something in our commonly evolved psyche forces each culture to invent the same imaginary flood legend with no basis in real history. Instead of scholarship, this is that willful ignorance of the fact that the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. And remember, we brought this up, 2 Peter 3, verses 5 and 6. Peter was prophesying that in the last days you will have people willfully ignorant or willfully forgetting that the world that then was being overflowed with water and perished. And that's what we're seeing today. So that's it. Any questions? Yes.
I have a question. This kind of relates to something else you covered probably, but length of years, does anyone, any person be able, would there have been anyone trying to date like when the flood took place based on genealogies of the Old Testament from the time of creation? Has anyone come up with that kind of, I don't know if anybody did that or not, I just wondered.
Oh, yes, yes. In fact, Answers in Genesis, they've documented from the beginning of creation based on what the Bible teaches, and then tracking through all the genealogies that are listed. So they have pretty strong dates on when the flood occurred, when it ended. Yeah, that exists today, those timelines. The 4004 BC that we hear from Bishop Ussher, that's a pretty accurate date. Yeah. So 4004 BC is a pretty valid date. So, we live in, 2024, so we're talking a little bit over 6,000 years today, that the existence of creation.
The other question I have is, it says in Scripture that the ark landed on Mount Ararat. Is that the Mount Ararat that exists today? There have been photographs taken from different people showing what looked like a boat sticking out of some of the mountain. I know we can't get in to see that, but has there been any speculation that might be the ark?
Yeah, Christian scientists don't believe it was necessarily on the top of Mount Ararat, but in the vicinity of Mount Ararat. And there is some people who believe that there is a ark-shaped vessel that's like embedded within the rock features in the mountains of Ararat. But Answers in Genesis feels that that's probably, if you think about it, a wooden ark to last this long would not be feasible, because we're talking many thousands of years ago, and wood doesn't hold its structure very long. Hopefully that answers the question. Okay. Any other comments on how Noah's family took care of the animals and any of these flood legends?
It's to me just our sinful mind.
Yeah.
I was trying to see that was too complex for a man like Noah that has not been to a university or have been trained in something. But when we start comparing to other things, and we know that God gave him the revelation himself on how to build those things, and we look to other things that in the history of humanity that has no explanation how they were built to, we say, why not?
Yeah, and also think in Noah's day, they lived to be over 900 years old, and God gave Noah a 120-year lead time, and it's documented in the Bible that they had this knowledge. And imagine, they were probably smarter, bigger, stronger. Remember we said the climate before the flood, they had more oxygen, more pressure, which helped them live longer, and their DNA wasn't contaminated like ours is today. So they were probably stronger, bigger. It's the evolutionary viewpoint that's making us think that, those were ape men back then. They were unsophisticated brutes. But actually they were probably smarter than we were. And probably the culture back then, there's stories that they probably invented even flying machines. And they were more, imagine if you had a smart person living to be 900 years old. Say some of the intelligent people today lived that long, they could probably invent a lot more technology than what we're doing today. But that whole pre-flood world was buried with all those, with the flood and the tsunami waves. It's gone. It's totally wiped out. And God was effective in killing the entire land and the people back then. So it's hard. But yeah, I like what you said. We're kind of indoctrinated in thinking that they couldn't do something like that. But if you think biblically they were probably smarter, and they had ways to create this. Like, remember we had that axe that was buried in the coal that's pure, it doesn't rust, and we couldn't even create that today. So it's amazing how that world was so different, but yet God was so disgusted with man that he wanted to destroy him because of his sin. The thoughts of his mind were sinful continually, and what that prophesies in the Bible, that's what it's going to be before Jesus returns.